Welcome to Archive Whispers, a place to fall asleep. Settle in, lower the lights, and let the archive open. The day's heat is still standing under the vine leaves, thick and sweet with the smell of warm dust and ripening grapes. You are in a long green tunnel in a walled garden across the river from Thebes, and overhead, trained across rough wooden beams, the vines hold out their clusters low and heavy, dark as deep water, near enough that you could reach up and cup one in your palm. The last of the sun comes in level from the far end of the tunnel, turning the layered leaves to green and gold, and the fine dust raised by the day's work drifts slowly through the light, in no hurry to settle. While you stand there, the first cool air of the evening arrives from the north and moves down the tunnel, and every leaf turns over once. Softly, the whole garden loosening as the day's heat lets go. Beyond the leaf roof, doves are settling in the fig trees, and the hanging fruit sways a little on its stem. This is Egypt in the New Kingdom, around 1400 BCE, in the last weeks of the dry season, when the river below the fields has already begun its slow rise, and the evening ahead is only the end of a picking day on a quiet estate, the vineyard settling toward night, the vat waiting, the tall clay jars standing empty and ready in the dark. The path from the house drops toward the garden in long, easy steps of packed earth, still warm through your sandals. Below you, inside its mud brick wall, the vineyard lies like a low green roof, row after row of vines carried overhead on wooden beams, and beyond them the pale gleam of the pool. The sun is nearly down. The air smells of dust and sweet fruit. At the bottom of the path, a doorway opens in the garden wall. The bricks around it still hold the day's heat. You can feel it against your palm as you pass. Beyond the threshold, the pergola begins, a green tunnel going away from you, its floor barred with the last stripes of low sun. Somewhere in the fig trees, birds are settling for the night. You walk between the rows. Short pillars of mud brick stand in quiet lines, each pair carrying a rough wooden beam, and over the beams the vines have knitted a ceiling of leaves. The clusters hang down through it at the height of your face, dark as river shadow, dusty to the touch. Your feet make almost no sound on the soft watered earth, and the whole enclosure smells of green leaf and warm dust. This is the last stretch of the dry season, the months the Egyptians called Shemu. Far to the south, the river has already begun its slow yearly rise, and within weeks the flood will come down the valley to the fields outside the wall. For now it still runs low between its banks. The grapes have taken all the sun they need. Toward evening, a breeze slides in from the north, as it does most days of the year, and the heat at last loosens its hold on the garden. Along the aisles, the day's work is ending. Two pickers pass you on their way to the gate, seen from behind, each with a wide basket of woven palm leaf riding on one shoulder. The baskets are heaped with dark clusters, and the smell of them reaches you before the men do, and stays after they have gone. These are the last loads of the evening. The vines they leave behind still carry fruit, hanging quietly in the dusk for another day. A garden very like this one was painted on the wall of a small tomb chapel in the hillside behind you, around the year 1400 BCE, most likely in the reign of Thutmose IV. The chapel belonged to Nakht, a scribe who watched the hours for the temple of Amun across the river, and to his wife Tawi, who sang in that temple's rites. Nakht was not a great lord, a working official no more. Yet in the one painted room of his chapel, among everything he chose to keep forever, there is a vineyard. Egyptian gardens were counted, tree by tree. 100 years before this evening, an architect named Ineni, builder for King Thutmose I, around 1500 BCE, had the full inventory of his garden written into his tomb chapel, some 450 trees in all. Around 170 date palms, 120 down palms, 73 sycamore figs, with pomegranates, tamarisks, and willows besides, and in that whole counted orchard, just 12 grapevines, 12. On a Theban estate, the vine was never a field crop. It was a treasure, set one by one among the fruit trees. The pool lies at the garden's heart, a long rectangle of still water with its corners squared, like everything else the estate builds. Lotus leaves rest on the surface without moving. Now and then a fish touches it from beneath, and a ring widens out and fades against the clay rim. Ducks are drifting in toward the edges for the night. The water keeps the color of the sky a little longer than the sky itself, a pale sheet of evening laid down among the dark trees. Pools like this one were painted with such care that we still know them leaf by leaf. In the tomb chapel of an official named Nebamun, made at Thebes some 50 years after Nakht's own, a painted garden pool survives. Fish and ducks crowd the water, flower borders hedge it round, and about its edges stand sycamore figs and date palms. The dates shown in every stage of ripeness together on one tree, green, amber, and brown, as if the painter could not bear to choose one week of the year over another. That painting hangs today in a museum far from Egypt. The thing itself is all around you, the same squared water, the same heavy fruit, the same evening. Watering is the garden's other evening work, and it is done with the shoulders. Two men move along the tree rows with wooden yokes, a round pottery jar swinging at either end, drawing from the pool and walking their slow circuits in the failing light. Every tree stands inside its own small ring of banked mud, and each ring is filled until the dark earth stops drinking. There was already an old joke about this. A school book 5 centuries old by this evening, copied out by generations of student scribes, teases the gardener whose yoke has worn his shoulders, who spends his morning soaking the leeks and his evening bent over the vegetables. Like most school jokes, it exaggerates. Like most, it grew from something true. By the gate, the day closes the way every day on an Egyptian estate closes, with writing. The pickers come in from the aisles one at a time and set their baskets down, and a scribe sits cross-legged beside the wall, palette on his knees, reed brush in hand, making a small black mark for every load that passes. Nothing moves here without being written. Not grain from the granary, not fruit from the garden, not these last baskets of the vintage. It is the quiet bookkeeping that holds the whole country together, and Nakht, whose first title was scribe, spent his own life making marks of just this kind for the temple across the river. Tonight another man counts, and the baskets file past him into the dusk. The workers gather at the foot of the wall, where the bricks still give back the day's warmth. Their pay is grain, wheat for bread, barley for beer, and their supper is what an Egyptian supper has almost always been: flat loaves, a jar of beer passed along the line, onions, a little dried fish. Low voices, the small knock of a cup set down on brick. The wine they have spent the day beginning is rarely theirs to drink. Wine in this country is for the master's table, for temple offerings, for feast nights. Beer is the drink of everyone, from the field hand to the king's kitchens. No one at the wall seems troubled by the arrangement. The beer is cool, and the evening is long. The north wind arrives in earnest now, as it does on most evenings of the Egyptian year, moving up the valley against the current of the river. The leaf ceiling stirs along its whole length, the palms lift and settle, and the held heat of the day goes out of the garden in one long breath. The Egyptians loved this wind the way other lands love rain. In the tomb of Paheri, a mayor of the town of El Kab, painted half a century before Nakht's chapel, the harvesters in the grain fields are given words to sing, written just above their heads. The north wind is come forth, they say. Let us work as our hearts may be bound. Gratitude for cooler air, the oldest work song there is. It should be said plainly, this is not Egypt's great wine country. The famous vineyards lie far to the north, in the western delta, where the river spreads toward the sea and whole estates give themselves over to the vine, and jars from those lands travel the length of the country. A Theban garden vineyard is a different kind of thing, a modest count of vines among hundreds of orchard trees, tended the way a family tends whatever it is proudest of. Its wine will fill only a small row of jars. But they will be this house's own jars, from its own arbor, trodden by feet the master knows by name, and there is a standing in that which no shipment from the delta can replace. The light is nearly gone. Up the slope in the doorway of the house, someone has set out the first lamp of the night, a shallow clay dish with a twist of linen for a wick, its small flame steady in the shelter of the wall. A moth has found it already, circling the small light without ever quite touching it. Down here the garden has gone gray-green, and then shadow. The last baskets stand together by the storeroom wall, covered over with vine leaves against the night air, and their smell, dust, sweetness, torn leaf, has become the smell of the whole enclosure. The birds in the fig trees have finished their settling. What remains is water, leaf sound, and the low voices by the wall, growing fewer. Stay in the aisle a little longer, looking down the dark tunnel of the vines. Every basket that passed you this evening was filled by the same few motions, repeated quietly under this ceiling of leaves. A reach upward, a turn of the wrist, a soft weight settling among the rest. It is a craft with its own rules and its own calendar, old already when Nakht's painter first mixed his colors, and old when that painter's grandfather was young. That is where the night goes next, to the hands themselves, and to the vines they know one by one. For now the garden settles into the dark, and the water keeps the last of the light. The picking is done entirely by hand. You reach up into the canopy, close your fingers around the cool weight of a cluster, and pull with a slow twist until the stem gives. No knife is needed, and none is shown, on the painted wall of Nakht's tomb chapel, made around 1400 BCE. The two harvesters simply pull the dark clusters down from the vines arching over their heads. It is work that asks patience rather than strength. A cluster torn too roughly drops its fruit into the dust. A cluster eased free comes away whole, and whole clusters travel better in the basket. The pickers have been moving through the low green tunnel since the worst of the heat began to lift. You work with both arms raised, which tires the shoulders quickly, so the line moves without hurry. A few clusters, a step, a few clusters more. The vines arch just above head height, and the fruit hangs down through the leaves where the warmth of the day still lingers. By dusk, the grapes come off cool to the touch. There is a quiet economy in the movement. The eyes find the ripe cluster, the fingers follow, the stem gives, and the hand comes down to the basket without looking. The baskets are woven from palm leaf and rush, wide and open at the mouth, light enough to swing from one hand when empty. Weavers make them from the split fronds of the date palm, plaited over and under in a coarse pattern that leaves the sides slightly yielding, so the fruit rides against a surface that gives. Grapes are not grain. They cannot be poured, and they cannot be heaped without cost. The clusters are laid in rather than dropped, stems upward, and each basket is filled only so deep, because fruit stacked too heavily crushes what lies beneath it. From the arbors to the buildings at the garden's edge is a short walk, and the full baskets make it on men's shoulders. You settle the load against the side of your neck, steady it with one raised hand, and keep to the packed earth path between the vine rows and the fig trees. The estate buildings are low and flat-roofed, mud brick plastered smooth, still holding the day's warmth in their walls. The carriers pass each other in the half-light, one line going out empty, one coming back full, at the unhurried pace of men who have done this every evening of the harvest. Nothing moves through an Egyptian estate without being written down. At the end of the path, a scribe sits cross-legged on a woven mat, a wooden pallet across his knees, and every basket pauses in front of him long enough to be marked. His reed brush touches the ink, then the papyrus, in small practiced strokes. It is the same accounting that follows the grain from the threshing floor and the fowl from the marsh nets. The estate's produce exists twice, once in the world and once in the record. The grapes of this evening are already becoming a number. The vine does not grow this way on its own. Left alone, it sprawls along the ground. Raised, it becomes architecture. The tomb paintings of these centuries show Egyptian gardeners training their vines in several ways, on forked wooden posts carrying a horizontal pole, on beams laid across rows of short pillars, on bent branches driven into the earth and arched over to make a green tunnel, and here and there as low, unsupported bushes. In the walled gardens of the great houses, the overhead form rules, because it does two jobs at once. The fruit hangs clear of the dust, and the household gains a shaded walk for the hottest hours. How much these overhead vines were loved, one tomb across the river makes plain. A generation before Nakht, the mayor of Thebes, a man named Senefer, who served Amenhotep II in the years around 1427 to 1401 BCE, and held the title overseer of the gardens of Amun, had the whole ceiling of his burial chamber painted as a grape arbor. Winding stems, broad leaves, heavy dark clusters, spread above the room the way a real canopy spreads above a garden walk. Visitors still call it the tomb of the vineyards. He chose of everything he might lie beneath forever, the underside of a vine. A vine like the ones overhead begins as a small thing in a pit of dark river silt, carried in from the fields because the garden's own ground is poor. The gardener waters it, shades it, and ties its first slender shoot to a forked post with soft cord of plant fiber. Year by year the shoot is led upward, then bent along the beam and bound again, until the wood thickens and holds the shape on its own. It is seasons of patience before a young vine gives a harvest worth the name, which is part of why a full arbor, heavy with fruit, is something an estate shows off. All of it depends on carried water. Each vine and each tree stands in its own round basin of raised earth, and twice a day, morning and evening, someone walks the rounds with a wooden yoke across the shoulders and a pottery jar swinging at either end, filling basin after basin from the garden pool. An old school book, composed around 1900 BCE and still copied out by schoolboys in Nakht's day, makes fun of the gardener for exactly this. He carries the yoke until his shoulders age, drenching the vegetables in the morning and standing in the mire at evening. It is satire, and it exaggerates. But the yoke is real, and so are the shoulders. The pool itself is the garden's quiet center, rectangular, mud-banked, cut so that the water sits below the level of the beds around it. Narrow channels lead away from its corners, and a gardener opens and closes them with a heel of mud, steering the water from one thirsty corner of the garden to another. In another generation or two, painters at Amarna will show gardeners lifting water with a long counterweighted sweep. The first surviving pictures of that device are still some 50 years away from this evening. Tonight the water rises the old way, in jars, on shoulders, one basin at a time. The vine keeps its own calendar inside the Egyptian year. Through the cool months it stands as bare gray wood along the beams, and the garden walk loses its roof of leaves. New leaf comes with the warming days, then flower, then hard green fruit, and the long dry season called Shemu does the slow work of sweetening. By late summer the clusters hang dark and full, and the household watches them the way it watches bread in the oven. The harvest falls at the very end of the dry season, these weeks, this heat, and the whole garden year narrows to a few evenings of picking. And the timing carries a meaning every Egyptian would feel without being told. Just as the grapes come in, the river begins to rise. Out beyond the garden wall, the Nile is already running heavier, browner, thick with the silt of far-off rains, and within weeks it will spread over the fields. New wine and new water arrive in the same season. Words far older than this garden, set down in pyramid chambers perhaps 1,000 years before Nakht, already call Osiris Lord of Wine at the inundation. The vintage and the flood belong to each other, and everyone treading this path at dusk knows it. It is worth saying plainly, this garden is not where most of Egypt's wine comes from. The great vineyards lie far to the north, in the western delta along the branch of the Nile that the jar labels call the Western River, and out in the desert oases to the west. Vines have grown in the delta since about 2700 BCE, the age of the Third Dynasty, more than 1,000 years before this evening, brought in long before from the Levant. A walled garden vineyard at Thebes is a smaller, dearer thing. A dozen vines in their shade inside an orchard, supplementing the northern estates rather than rivaling them. How dear the counted orchard of Ineni has already told us. Hundreds of trees, and just 12 vines set among them like pieces of treasure. It is worth pausing on that number a moment longer. 12 vines on the estate of one of the great builders of Thebes, a man who could have had anything planted that Egypt grew, and still the vine came in ones and twos, coaxed along arbors, watered by hand, guarded from the birds. A vine at Thebes was never a crop. It was a possession. And this garden, with its own dozen, is wealthy in exactly that quiet way. The last basket of the evening is set down inside the doorway, in the lamplit room where the others already stand in their quiet rows. Outside, the arbor empties. The pickers rinse their hands at the pool's edge, and the leaves overhead settle into the stillness they keep all night. Under the low green roof, the remaining clusters hang untouched, saved for tomorrow's picking, breathing their faint, sweet smell into the dark. Indoors, the day's fruit rests in the palm leaf weave, cool and whole, waiting for the work that comes next, work done not with hands but with feet. The last baskets of the evening do not go to the house. They go to the far corner of the walled garden, where the storerooms stand, and where the real work of the night is waiting. You follow the carriers along the edge of the pool, under the last stretch of the pergola, and you smell it before you see it. The sweet, heavy scent of opened grapes gathering in the cooling air the way smoke gathers under a roof. Ahead, in the dusk, stands the treading vat, wide and shallow, raised to the height of a man's waist, with a wooden beam above it and short ropes hanging down, perfectly still. No treading vat from Nakht's century has ever been found. The paintings are our only record of it. So scholars read the paintings closely, and what they describe is a broad open basin, large enough for 4, 5, or 6 men to stand in together, built of wood or stone or mud plaster, its inner walls smoothed so that nothing rough met the fruit or the feet. In the picture that guides us tonight, the vat is painted pale, almost white, as if plastered or cut from stone. However it was made, it had to carry the weight of men and grapes, and it had to let the juice run out low on one side, through a single narrow spout. The beam overhead is not decoration. A man treading grapes stands in a slick of crushed fruit, ankle deep and deepening, and his footing is gone within the first few minutes. So the builders raised a frame above the vat, a horizontal wooden crossbeam carried on 2 upright posts, and hung short ropes from it, 1 for each man. In the painting from Nakht's chapel, the 2 posts are shaped like bundles of papyrus, their tops flaring open like the plant itself, a small elegance in a working machine. Each treader grips his rope with a raised hand and keeps his balance that way, hour after hour, all evening. That painting deserves a moment of its own. It survives on the west wall of a small tomb chapel at Thebes, the chapel of Nakht, a scribe who also held the title of Hour Watcher of Amun, one of the quiet officials who timed the temple's rituals by the stars. His chapel was decorated around 1400 BCE, most likely in the reign of Thutmose IV, and it was never finished. Only one small room was ever painted. Yet into that one room the painters put a complete grape harvest, the picking, the treading, the running juice, the waiting jars, all in a single narrow strip. Look closely at the treading, and the painters have counted for you. 5 men stand in the pale vat, 3 facing 2, each holding his short rope. Their kilts hitched higher than the pickers, so the juice will not reach the cloth. At the right of the strip, 2 harvesters pull dark clusters down from the overhead vine with their bare hands. There is no knife anywhere in the scene. At the left, the juice runs from the spout into a lower stone tank, where a man crouches to gather it, and 4 tall pottery jars stand ready in a row. 1 wall, 1 evening's work, complete from vine to vessel. Now the baskets arrive at your own vat, and the grapes go in, tipped over the rim in dark whispering falls until the floor of the basin is covered knee-deep. You climb the low step, take hold of a rope, and lower your feet into the mash. It is cooler than you expect. The day's heat has already left the fruit, and what remains is a soft, yielding coolness that gives under your heels and rises between your toes, skins and stems and juice together. You lean on the rope, shift your weight, and begin the slow, deliberate walking that will continue deep into the night. Treading was never solitary work. The vat holds a small crew, and the crew moves as one, lean step, because 5 men stepping at random would only stumble against each other. In the tomb of Paheri at El Kab, a mayor who served under Thutmose III around 1450 BCE, the painters arranged the treaders as 2 groups of 3, facing each other across the vat like partners in a slow dance, every raised hand on a rope. It is the same answer, a generation or 2 before Nakht. Keep the rhythm shared, keep the weight moving evenly, and the fruit gives up its juice without anyone falling. And where there is shared rhythm, there is usually song. Above the farm scenes of Paheri's tomb, the painters wrote short chants in hieroglyphs. A threshing song to the oxen survives complete, and one refrain of the age welcomes the cool north wind as it comes forth, calling the crews to work as their hearts may be bound. Whether the treaders had their own words at the vat, no securely translated line survives, and we will not invent one. It is enough to know that gangs like this one sang as they worked, and that the sound over the garden at dusk was voices keeping time, low and unhurried, above the wet steps. Low in the wall of the vat, the spout begins its work. The first juice finds it early, a thin dark thread at first, then a steady small stream running out into the open tank below. In Nakht's painting, the stream is shown red, and the man at the tank crouches with his hands ready, tending it as it gathers. There is a word for it, must, the fresh-run juice, cloudy with pulp and fine skins, deep purple-red in the last light, sweeter than anything else the estate produces. It will keep running long after the treaders believe the fruit is finished, which is one reason the walking goes on so long. When the treading has taken all it easily can, there is one more step, though Nakht's painters left it out of their strip. The trodden skins and stems still hold juice, and the Egyptians recovered it with a long cloth sack, twisted between poles until the last of the liquid dripped into a vessel beneath. The method was already old. In the tomb of Mereruka at Saqqara, a vizier of about 2340 BCE, 5 men worked such a sack together. By Nakht's century, the sack was mounted on a fixed wooden frame, which needed fewer hands. There is no screw and no lever in any of it. Those belong to much later ages. Feet, cloth, and patience. Beside the vat, in many gardens like this one, stood something small and easily missed, a shrine about the size of a bread oven. It does not appear in Nakht's own chapel, his painters kept to the work, but other Theban tomb chapels of the same age show it plainly. In the chapel of a priest named Kayamwaset, 6 men tread the grapes holding their ropes while, just beside the vat, a priest sets an offering before Renenutet, the cobra goddess of the harvest. The shrine is mud brick, the figure within it small, the gesture unhurried, a dish set down, a stillness at the edge of the working sound. Renenutet had watched over Egyptian plenty for centuries by Nakht's time. From the Middle Kingdom onward, she is the guardian of fields, granaries, and storerooms, shown as a rearing cobra or as a woman with a cobra's head, and called mistress of provisions. Her place at the vat made plain sense to the people who set her there. The year's wine was provision like any other, and it began at this exact spot where the juice left the fruit. So a cup of the new must was set on her dish, with a cluster of grapes beside it, before the jars were filled, the vintage acknowledged before it was counted. Her own festival fell months earlier, at the start of the grain harvest in spring, when her son Nipri, the grain itself, was said to be born. The vintage was not her feast day. But wherever the tomb painters of this age recorded winemaking, the offering at the vat appears among the ordinary steps of the work, picking, treading, offering, filling, sealing, as if piety was simply one more stage of production, no more remarkable than coiling the ropes at the end of the night. Perhaps that is the calmest way to understand it. Not a ceremony interrupting the evening, but a habit inside it, the way a workman touches the doorpost of a familiar room. Wine itself belonged, in the Egyptian mind, to gladness, and gladness belonged to Hathor. Around 1470 BCE, some 2 generations before Nakht, Hatshepsut built a columned porch at the precinct of the goddess Mut at Karnak for a festival of drunkenness held soon after the flood arrived. The drink there was beer, brewed in quantity and shared until sleep came, and the sleepers were woken gently with drumming to meet the goddess. In much later ages, at her temple of Dendera, Hathor would be called Lady of Drunkenness. Here in the garden, the connection is quieter. The jars now waiting by the tank will one day pour at feasts held partly in her honor. There was an older god of the pressing too. In the pyramid texts, carved almost 1,000 years before this evening, a god named Shesmu presses wine and brings grape juice to the dead king, words already ancient when Nakht was born. But in the garden scenes of his century, it is not Shesmu who stands beside the treading vat. It is the cobra of the harvest, small and patient in her mud brick niche, and the men who pass her keep their rhythm without breaking it. Old gods settle into new corners of the work, the way old tools do, and the treading goes on above them, wet, steady, unchanged. By full dark, the first crew has done its share. The men climb out one at a time, each hand leaving its rope swinging gently, legs stained to the knee with a color that will outlast many washings. Someone has set a small oil lamp in a shallow clay dish on the storeroom step, and by its low flame the overseer looks into the tank. How much has run? How much is still to come? The second crew steps in. The vat is never emptied in one turn. Treading is measured in watches, like the night itself, and the sound of slow feet in wet fruit simply changes owners for a while. You stand at the edge of the tank a moment before going in. The must lies dark and quiet now, its surface holding one small copy of the lamp flame, and the tall jars wait in their row against the wall, empty tonight, spoken for tomorrow. Behind you the ropes hang still over the vat, and the garden has folded its sounds away, one by one, into the moving of leaves. The juice has left the fruit. That was the evening's whole task, and it is done. What the jars will do with it, the slow sealed work of the days ahead, belongs to the morning, and the morning is welcome to it. Beside the treading vat, the empty jars have been waiting all afternoon. They lean together against the mud brick wall of the yard, shoulder to shoulder, just as they were leaned this morning when the boys carried them out 2 at a time. Each is a tall, slender thing of pale buff clay, and each tapers to a narrow point at the base, so that a jar on its own cannot stand at all. It must be held by a wall, by a low ring of clay, by a pit of sand. The treading is nearly done now. The light is going amber, and the jars hold the last of it on their shoulders, waiting to be filled. Take one in your hands, and you find it is heavier than it looks. The clay is marl, a paler, harder clay than the dark silt of the fields, and it fires to a soft cream that stays cool in the heat. 2 small loop handles sit at the shoulder, just large enough for a finger and thumb. You carry the jar cradled against your chest, not swinging at your side. Potters here on the Theban side turn these out by the 100, perhaps. Some scholars think in a workshop under the crown's own eye, and every estate along the river takes them in by the boatload. The jar itself is not precious. What matters is what it will hold. The shape came from the north. Traders out of Canaan had long carried their wine south in tall clay jars, and the Egyptians, who liked the wine, kept the jars and then learned to make them. Egyptian potters took up the form late in the reign of Thutmose I, and by the joint rule of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, 2 or 3 generations before this evening, it was fully at home here. One surviving jar carries an ink date from year 7 of that shared reign. So the vessel your vintner reaches for, around 1400 BCE, is no foreign curiosity. It is as ordinary to him as the basket and the hoe. Now the filling begins. A man crouches at the collecting basin below the vat's spout, dips a wide clay jug, and pours the dark must through a funnel into the first jar's narrow mouth. The juice is still warm from the day and from the treading, purple-black in the low light, flecked with skins. It takes many jugfuls to fill one jar, and the pourer works without hurry, listening to the pitch of the sound rise as the level climbs. When it nears the shoulder he stops. The wine will need room to move in the days ahead, and the next empty jar is tipped upright and held steady for him. The filled jars travel at once, while the evening is still cool. 2 men take each one, arms crossed beneath the swell of the body, and walk it across the darkening garden, past the rectangular pool where the last light lies flat and pale, under the fig trees, to a long, low room of mud brick built where the wall keeps off the sun for most of the day. This is the wine store, and tonight it is the busiest room on the estate. Inside, a single oil lamp burns in a shallow clay dish, and the doorway swallows one pair of shoulders after another, jar after jar after jar. Inside, the making of wine passes out of human hands. The must goes first into wide open vessels, and for a while nothing seems to happen at all. Then, some hours in, the surface begins to stir, a seam of tiny bubbles at the rim, then a low ring of foam, then a slow, steady working through the whole body of the juice. No one in this room can say what causes it. The wine simply begins on its own, as it has every year in living memory. The store fills with a low, sweet smell, half fruit and half bread, and there is nothing for anyone to do but let it work. How long that first open ferment lasted, no Egyptian ever wrote down. The scholars who study the paintings and the jar residues will commit to only this much: days, not months. A lighter wine was drawn off sooner. A heavier, sweeter one was left to work longer in the open air. When the vintner judges the moment right, by taste, by smell, by the quieting of the foam, the young wine is poured off into the tall jars, skins and stems left behind, and each jar is carried to its place along the wall. What was juice this afternoon is already on its way to being something else. Sealing a jar is quick work in practiced hands. First, a small cover for the mouth itself, a pad of woven reeds, a circle of cloth, sometimes a little pottery dish turned upside down. Then the mud. It comes up from the river, wet and gray and smooth, and it is molded over the mouth and the cover together in a thick domed cap, worked down onto the shoulder until the join disappears. A day or two of dry air will set it nearly as hard as the jar itself. Nothing gets in after that, not air, not flies, not a curious finger, and the wine is safe from everything but time. But the cap is not finished until it has been given a hole. Near the top of the wet mud, the sealer presses in a reed and draws it out again, leaving a passage no wider than a straw. This is the jar's breathing hole. The young wine inside is still fermenting, still releasing its slow breath of gas, and a jar sealed blind would strain against what it holds. So each jar breathes through its small vent for as many days as the wine needs, and when the working inside has gone quiet, a plug of fresh mud closes the hole, and the seal at last is complete. While the mud is still soft, it is stamped. A small seal is pressed into the cap again and again, leaving rows of neat oval marks that name the estate to anyone who knows how to read them. This is old habit, older than nearly anything else in the room. Egyptians had been closing jars with stamped mud caps since the first dynasty, around 3000 BCE, 16 centuries before this evening, when the storehouses of the very first kings were sealed with the same device. The stamp is a signature and a lock in one. To reach the wine you must break it, and a broken seal cannot lie. Last comes the ink. A scribe settles on a low stool beside the finished jars with a reed brush and a small pot of black ink, and writes a single line across each jar's shoulder in quick, flowing hieratic, the everyday running hand of Egypt. The line follows a set order, the same on estate after estate. The year of the reigning king, for Egypt counts its years by each reign in turn. Then the word for what is inside, then the estate that made it, then the district it came from, and last, the name and title of the chief vintner who answers for it. A complete label in one brushed line. The wine now carries its own record. You step to the doorway for air, and the garden beyond has gone fully dark. How do we know what such a scribe wrote? Mostly from cellars slightly later than this one. A generation after this evening, on this same western bank of Thebes, the palace of Amenhotep III at Malkata kept jars by the thousand, and its ruins have given up some 1,400 ink dockets, labels for wine, ale, fat, and meat, the whole royal larder together, with wine among the largest groups. Reading them, you can watch the same 5-part formula repeat, jar after jar, year after year. The steady bookkeeping of an estate's sweetest work. The names survive too. A lifetime after this evening, jars sealed for a young king's tomb would carry the names of the men who answered for their wine. Kaha, Senufer, Rare, chief vintners of the great Delta estates. One of those jars, from about 1322 BCE, reads in full, Year 5, wine of the estate of Tutankhamun, ruler of Thebes, in the Western River, chief vintner Ka. A working man's name, brushed onto a clay shoulder in a moment, and still legible 3,500 years on. Whoever writes the dockets in this store tonight is part of the same long ledger, most of it now dust, a little of it remembered. The dockets even graded the wine. The word was nefer, good, and the scale was simple repetition. Nefer for good, nefer, nefer for twice good, nefer, nefer for the finest in the cellar. Some labels add that the wine was sweet or blended, and they name the great vineyards. The most prized wine of the age came from the Western River, the westernmost branch of the Nile far to the north, in the Delta, whose estates fill the labels of the palace cellars. A garden vineyard like this one will never rival that country, and does not need to. Its wine has only to reach its own household, its offering table, and its master's guests. The word the scribe writes for wine is irip. It is an old word even now. It appears on stone and on jar seals of the Second Dynasty, around 2900 to 2700 BCE, from kings whose names were already ancient in Nakht's day. And it is a broad word. Chemists in our own time, testing residues from royal jars a few generations younger than this evening, found that both red wine and white traveled under the same name. The label never says which. In this store, though, there is no doubt. The must ran purple-black from the vat, and the wine in these jars will be dark. There is one famous drink you will not find on this estate's shelves tonight. Shideh, the most prized drink in later Egyptian records, first appears on jar labels at Amarna, some 50 years after this evening, and wherever it appears, it carries the high grade, twice good, never less. For a long time, modern scholars argued over what it even was. Many said pomegranate. Then in 2006, chemists analyzed the residue of a Shideh jar from Tutankhamun's tomb, and the analysis showed red grapes, a grape drink after all, prepared in some special way, perhaps filtered or gently heated, that set it apart from ordinary irep. Nakht's cellar holds no Shideh. His grandchildren's cellars might. It is worth remembering, among all these jars, how few Egyptians will ever taste one. Beer is the daily drink of everyone, field hand, scribe, child at supper. Wine belongs largely to the king, the temples, and houses like this one, which is exactly why a modest official paints a vineyard on the wall of his tomb chapel. And the estates knew their own worth. Vineyard names on the oldest labels read like small poems. One royal domain of the Third Dynasty, more than 12 centuries before this evening, called its wine the Star of Horus on the height of heaven. The jars in this room will carry a humbler name and be drunk no less gratefully. The lamp is burning low now, and the work is nearly done. Along the wall, the finished jars lean shoulder to shoulder, pale bodies under gray-stamped caps, each with its one brushed line of ink, each breathing softly through its small open vent. The scribe gathers his brushes and his ink pot. The carriers stack the last empty baskets by the door. Outside, the garden has gone quiet under the first stars, and the estate is settling toward its own rest. In the morning there will be more picking, more treading, more jars. For now the store is full of new wine, and the evening is nearly over. By full dark, the estate has gone quiet. The pickers left at dusk, filing out through the gate in the mud brick wall with their empty baskets, and the treading vat stands rinsed and still beneath its wooden crossbeam. Somewhere in the house a door is drawn shut. Under the pergola, the leaves have closed into one unbroken roof of shadow, and the clusters that were not cut today hang in the dark like quiet weights, waiting their turn. The ground gives back the heat of the afternoon slowly and evenly, the way a bread oven keeps its warmth long after the fire has died down. The garden holds its breath and then lets it go. A breeze arrives from the north, the way it does on most evenings at this season, moving up the valley against the current of the river. The Egyptians counted the sweet breath of the north wind among the finest things a life could hold. In a tomb at El Kab, painted around 1450 BCE, a harvest gang's chant is written above the field scenes. The north wind is come forth. Let us work as our hearts may be bound, a workman's chant of the age. Tonight the same wind turns the vine leaves over one by one, a dry, papery sound that travels down the pergola walks and fades at the wall. At the center of the garden, the rectangular pool lies black and still, holding a thin image of the moon. The ducks have folded themselves onto the bank, head under wing, and now and then a fish touches the surface from below, so that the moon's reflection bends and settles again. A garden very much like this one was painted for an official named Nebamun around 1350 BCE, a pool crowded with fish and waterfowl, hedged by flower borders, ringed by sycamore figs and date palms with fruit at every stage of ripeness. What the painters loved best about such gardens, the night keeps, water, shade, and the slow patience of trees. In the house, one lamp is still burning, a small flame standing in a shallow open dish of clay. This is the household of Nakht, a scribe and an hour watcher of Amun, one of those who kept the night stars for the great temple across the river. His wife Tawi served there too, as a chantress of Amun, a singer in the temple ceremonies. It is a modest household by the measure of Thebes, a temple functionary's estate rather than a great lord's. Supper was bread and vegetables and beer. The wine is not for supper. The wine lies counted in the storeroom, for offerings, for guests, for the feast days of the year. Along the outer wall, the workers' quarters are settling too. The everyday meal of an Egyptian laborer was bread and beer with onions and a little dried fish, and it was the same on this estate as anywhere in the valley. Records from the workmen's village at Deir el-Medina, later in the New Kingdom, show wages paid out in grain, wheat for bread, barley for beer, with every measure passing under a scribe's eye before it left the granary. Beer belonged to everyone, from the field hand to the king. Wine belonged for the most part to the temples and the great houses, which is precisely why a man like Nakht had his vineyard painted on the wall of his tomb chapel. Step through the low doorway of the storeroom and the night changes temperature. The room is cool, dry, and dark, and it smells of clay and faintly of fruit. Tall wine jars lean shoulder to shoulder against the mud brick walls, their narrow pointed bases set into the sandy floor, their mouths closed under domed caps of gray-dried river mud. On the newest jars, a small hole near the top of each cap has been left open, so the young wine inside can breathe out as it finishes its slow work. On the older jars, the hole is plugged and sealed over. A single lamp in a clay dish keeps the whole room in soft amber. Each jar carries a short line of black ink on its pale shoulder. The year of the rain, the estate, the man responsible, so that to walk down a row is to read back through the summers, jar by jar. This is the bookkeeping of the age. One generation after this evening, the palace of Amenhotep III at Malkata, on this same western bank of Thebes, would hold some 1,400 such ink labels in the decades around 1360 BCE, naming wine and ale and fat and meat laid up for the king's jubilee festivals, with wine the largest share of them all. A storeroom like this one is a small archive, and the scribe its quiet librarian. The ink remembers people as well as years. A lifetime after Nakht, jars sealed for the burial of the young king, Tutankhamun would still carry the names of the men who made the wine. Chief Vintner Ka, Chief Vintner Senufe, Chief Vintner Rare, each name brushed onto the clay beside the year and the estate. 3,500 years later, those lines can still be read. The name of a working man, set down by a tired scribe at the end of a pressing season, outlasting almost everything else the estate ever made. Somewhere in this room, tonight's jars carry a name of their own. Not all of these jars will stay on the estate. Wine stood among the regular offerings of the gods, and on temple walls the king is shown holding out 2 small round pots of wine to a seated deity, a scene already 1,000 years old by Nakht's evening, carved first in the pyramid temple of King Sahura, and repeated in every age after. Across the river, in the temple of Amun at Karnak, where Nakht watched the hours of the night, wine from estates like this one entered the storerooms of the god, was poured in the sanctuary at the daily service, and was counted, always counted, on its way in. Other jars go to the feasts. In the tomb of Paheri at El Kab, painted in the reign of Thutmose III, a banquet guest named Nubmehi calls out for 18 bowls of wine, complaining that his insides are as dry as straw, and the serving man beside him urges a lady to drink deep and make it a happy day. Nakht's own chapel has its banquet too. Guests seated on woven mats, lotus flowers, small faience cups, and a blind harper singing with his eyes painted as simple slits. Wine was for such nights, poured slowly, praised freely, and accounted for the next morning by a scribe with a steady hand. Outside again, the night has deepened. By the gate in the garden wall, a watchman has settled for his shift, a plain figure with a staff, his small fire down to embers. Every walled garden kept some kind of watch when the fruit hung ripe. The harvest is wealth, and it hangs at shoulder height in the dark. He does not walk much. He listens to the pool, to the wall, to the dry conversation of the leaves, and the garden's sounds arrange themselves around him, a duck shifting on the bank, a palm frond ticking against another, the small dry rustle of something moving in the vines. Beyond the wall, past the dark orchard rows, the river shows as a broad, pale ribbon under the moon. It is rising in these weeks. Far to the south, the flood has already begun, and night by night the water creeps up the mudflats, turning brown with silt, carrying the year's new soil toward the fields. The grape harvest fell just here in the calendar, in late summer as the flood was arriving, and the old hymns bound the two together, in words already 1,000 years old by Nakht's evening, cut into the pyramid chambers of much earlier kings. Osiris is called Lord of Wine at the inundation. 1,000 years after this evening, A Greek traveler would write that the Egyptians had no vines in their country at all, and brewed their drink from barley instead. He was mistaken. Elsewhere in his own pages, the priests of Egypt are served grape wine, and the painted wall of Nakht's small chapel answers him quietly across the centuries. The Arbour heavy with clusters, the 5 men treading in the vat, the juice running to the tank, the sealed jars standing in their row. The vines were here. The proof of them was set in paint within sight of the river, and it is legible still. The harvest is not finished. Whole pergola walks still carry their fruit, and the empty palm leaf baskets stand stacked by the pillars where the pickers left them, ready for tomorrow. The work will take up again in its own order, water carried to the young trees in the cool of the morning, the garden's ordinary chores through the day, and then when the light softens, hands reaching up into the leaves once more, the vat wet again, the storeroom door open. An estate in harvest lives by that rhythm for weeks, unhurried and exact, until the last cluster has come down and the last cap of mud is stamped. Deeper in the night, the orchard keeps its own quiet order. Each young tree stands in a round basin of raked mud that holds its water through the heat. Low ridges divide the beds into neat squares, moonlight resting in the grid like pale thread. A dome palm forks against the stars. The sycamore figs hold their broad leaves perfectly still between one breath of wind and the next. Against the wall, a wooden shoulder yoke leans where its carrier set it down, 2 water jars waiting beneath it for the morning. The whole garden paused mid-task, certain of being resumed. Late now, the lamp in the house is put out, and the estate joins the darkness around it. The gate is shut. The watchman's embers breathe in and out at the foot of the wall. In the storeroom, the new jars stand closed under their caps of mud, and the smell of the pressing still hangs in the doorway. The river rises at its own pace. The vines hold their fruit until morning. The ducks are asleep on the bank of the pool. Whatever remains to be done belongs to tomorrow, and tomorrow knows its work. The garden settles a little deeper into the night, and the night receives it. The last door has been shut for the night, and the garden has the dark to itself now. Under the pergola, the vine leaves hang without moving, a low roof of leaves above a low path of dust, and the air beneath them is warm and sweet and dark. Nothing in the garden is working any longer. Nothing in the garden is waiting. The ground gives back the heat of the afternoon a little at a time, slowly, without being asked, and the smell of the day's picking still rests under the vines, faint now and round and kind. There is nothing left in this evening that needs you. If you stood beneath the vines now, you would see almost nothing. Only the deeper dark of the leaf roof against the paler dark of the sky, and here and there the round shapes of the hanging clusters, heavier tonight than they were in spring, heavy and full and quiet. The grapes do not know that the day is over. They go on doing what they have done all season, so slowly that no eye could ever catch them at it, swelling a little, sweetening a little, leaning into their own weight. The north wind that cooled the pickers has gone down to almost nothing. A low breath now. It moves one leaf and rests, and moves one leaf again. The garden pool keeps the last of the sky on its surface, a faint pale sheen among the dark shapes of fig and palm. The fish that rose all afternoon have settled low in the warm water. The ducks have folded themselves onto the bank, head under wing. Every now and then something touches the surface. A moth, a falling petal, a drop shaken from a leaf, and a single ring widens out, slow and round, until the stillness takes it back. That is the pace of things now. One small touch, one slow ring. Then the water smooths itself, and the garden goes on resting all around it. Somewhere at the edge of the garden you are lying still, on a reed mat perhaps, near a mud brick wall that kept a little of the afternoon and is giving it back now, slowly, through the dark. The sounds that reach you are few, and all of them are round-edged, water moving somewhere in the channel, a dove shifting its weight in the fig tree, dry leaves touching one another and going still again. None of it is speaking to you. None of it is asking anything of you. It is only the garden turning over once in its long sleep and settling deeper. All the work of this long day has already found its resting place. The baskets are stacked empty by the wall, still smelling faintly of the fruit they carried. The treading vat stands quiet under its beam, rinsed and dark. And behind the storeroom door, in the coolest room of the estate, the new jars stand shoulder to shoulder, capped with soft gray mud, holding the whole of this summer inside them. Let your thoughts go and rest there for a while in that low room. It is a good room to be sleepy in. Nothing moves there, and yet nothing there is idle. The storeroom holds its own kind of night, older and stiller than the night outside. The air is cool, and it smells of damp clay, of new wine, of dust that has settled and will not be raised again before morning. Along the walls, the tall jars lean together in rows, shoulder against shoulder, their pointed feet set in the sand of the floor, their round bellies pale in the dark. If a lamp were carried in, its light would find nothing to do here. The jars need no light. What is happening in this room is happening in the dark, and the dark suits it well. On the newest jars, the mud caps are still drying, gray and damp, pressed down by hands that are washed now and resting. Under each cap, a whole year has been closed in. The river that rose, the long white afternoons, the shade of the leaves, the weight of the clusters, all of it sealed beneath a small rounded cap of river mud. And inside each jar, in the dark, the wine has already begun its own slow work. It worked while the household ate. It works now while the household sleeps. It will still be working, unhurried, long after this night has folded itself away. There is nothing to see, even if you could see it. The work the wine does is quieter than breathing, slower than the drying of mud. Sweetness turning, little by little, into depth. Brightness folding itself away into something low and round and heavy and dark. No hand can help it. No lamp can hurry it. No voice, however kind, can call it along faster than it means to go. It is the slowest work on the whole estate, and the only work that goes on at this hour, and it asks for nothing. No tending, no turning, no remembering. It simply goes on, down in the dark, at its own sweet pace. That is the gift of the sealed jar. Once the mud goes on, the worry goes out. No one on the estate will open these jars for months, and no one needs to. The ripening belongs to the jars now, and jars are good at holding things. It is all they do. They hold the summer. They hold the sweetness. They hold the long, slow change that no eye will ever see. So whatever small, unfinished things you are still holding tonight, you may treat them the same way. Cap them gently. Set them in a row against a wall somewhere at the back of your mind, and leave them to ripen on their own until morning. Months from now, on some cool evening, someone will read the ink on a pale clay shoulder, lift away the cap, and pour out a cupful of this summer, and find it deep and sweet and dark. But that evening is far away, and it is not yours to think about. Between now and then, there is only the storeroom dark, and the low round patient standing of the jars, and the wine working, softer than sleep itself. Nothing in that room will change tonight in any way an eye could find. And still, all night long, everything in it is quietly becoming. Let the storeroom fade behind you now, and drift back out under the open sky. The estate lies low and rounded about the garden. Low roofs, softened walls, the gentle shapes that mud brick takes after enough summers. Nothing here stands sharp against the night. Everything leans a little, settles a little, the whole place easing itself down toward the earth it was raised from. Far off, the river slides past in the dark, too slow and too wide to make a sound you could hold. The vines rest, the pool rests. The jars stand in their cool room doing their slow, sweet work, and the house sleeps on its own warmth like bread still cooling. Above the dark path, the pergola goes on holding up its fruit, all night, without effort. The beams were set for this. The pillars were built for this. The vines were led along them, year after year, for this, so that the heavy clusters could hang in the cool air and be carried, and nothing and no one would have to strain. That is how the whole garden passes the night, everything resting on something older that bears it easily. The fruit rests on the beams rest on the pillars rest on the earth, and you, wherever you are lying, are resting on all of it at once. The air that finds you now has been everywhere in the garden already. It has moved under the vine leaves and come away sweeter. It has crossed the pool and come away cooler. It has drifted along the warm brick of the storeroom wall and come away slower. There is nothing in it but the day just ended. Leaf and water, dust and fruit, warm mud and sweet dark shade, and every breath of it settles a little lower than the last, a little rounder, a little heavier, a little nearer the quiet floor of the evening. One by one, the last named things of the evening can be set down now. The vines low and green dark, and done for the day. The pool round and still, and holding nothing but sky. The jars heavy and patient, and full of slow, sweet work that no one needs to mind. The house warm and low, and breathing in its sleep. Say each of them once, somewhere far back in your mind, and let each one come out quieter than the last. There is no order to keep. There is no list to finish. Whatever is left unnamed tonight will settle on its own. And when even those are gone, the wine will still be working, low in its jars, in the dark, in the coolest room of the sleeping house. It does not need the morning. It does not need the vintner. It does not need you. It is the quietest worker in Egypt, and it has the whole night and the whole winter, and all the slow months after, and it is never in a hurry, never behind, never waiting on anyone at all. Let it go on without you now. The garden is dark, the jars are full, the year is sealed, and everything that ripens from here on ripens by itself.
You've reached the end of tonight's archive. If you're still awake, thank you for staying. And if you drifted off somewhere in the dark, then it did its work. Rest now. The next chapter will be here when you are. Sleep well. This has been Archive Whispers.